Hi everyone, in this video we will be working on this cherry blossom loom bracelet pattern as well as this bangle that I designed to be worn stacked with the loom bracelet. So for this pattern I won't have a bead set available for sale in my coffee shop because I chose these colors specifically for this pattern, and I'm not sure that I can actually make multiple designs just based on these particular colors. However, if you would like to support my channel, I do have a bead set that I made for this bangle that is available for sale on my coffee shop. So this is what the bead sets look like, and I have all of the details and descriptions on my Ko-fi page, which I'll put a link in the description section below as well as in the comment section. So please have a look and I appreciate your support. Alright, so to get started, you're going to need to figure out how long of a bead section you're going to need. And so my wrist is 5.5 inches and I want a final bracelet size of 6 inches. So your beaded section is going to be 1 inch less than your desired final size. So in my case, it's going to be 5 inches because you're going to need to leave 1 inch for the clasp. So my beaded section is going to be 5 inches. So in my pattern, I provided a guide for getting to 5 inch, 5.5 inches, and a 6 inch beaded section. Because my pattern has a defined center, when you are trying to get to your final size, you want to reduce them evenly on either end. So for me to get to my desired final beaded section of 5 inches, I need to take out these areas from both ends, and that way you can still maintain the center. As usual, here is the pattern that you can take a screenshot of, or if you would like a high resolution version to download to your devices or to print out, I have that in my Ko-fi page. So I'll put a link to that in the description section as well as in the comment section. And I have also listed out all the colors that I am using. So to warp my loom for the outer doubled edges, I'm going to be using Ceylon size D beading thread in the color Light Orchid because it matches one of my bead colors really well. And then for the inner warp strands, I'm going to be using John Bead Good thread in the color White. And the reason I'm using the Light Orchid thread is because the edges are going to be exposed or they're going to be seen. So that's why I just want the thread to match my beads better. And also I'm going to be using this thread as my horizontal weft thread. So to start warping the loom, I'm just going to tie a double knot to secure this thread. So after I have secured my warp strand, I want to center my piece for when I'm working. So the design is 13 beads wide. So I'm going to count 6 to the left. So from the center, I'm going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I'm going to place my thread on that 6th slot. And I'm going to do the same for the bottom. So from the center, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So I have placed my thread on that 6th slot as well from the center. And I'm just going to loop my thread around this knob to secure that thread. And because I want to double my first and my last strand, I'm just going to go back into the same slot that my thread is in because this is my first warp strand. And the reason I'm doubling my first and my last strand is because it makes the bracelet stronger because the first and the last strand is exposed. So I want to have that extra security of having 2 threads in the first and the last warp strands. So I'm just looping my thread once around this bar because I actually want to only put this colored thread in my first and my last warp strand. And I'm going to fill in the middle with the John Bead Good thread in white. So our design is 13 beads wide, which means that we need 14 warp strands because we always need 1 extra warp strand than the number of beads that we have across, because 14 strands will create the 13 spaces that we're going to need to fill in with our beads. So from here, that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So I'm going to put my thread in that 14th slot right there. And I'm going to do the same for the bottom. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. So this is the 14th slot. And again, I'm going to loop my thread around that knob and double up. So put my thread back into the same slot that it was in before. And now I'm gonna tie this thread off. I'm just gonna cut myself a little extra. And I'm just going to loop this thread a couple of times and tie a couple of knots. So now that I've done both the first and the last strand in my Ceylon D thread, I'm going to fill in the middle with my John Bead Good thread in the color white. But because this spool is too large to fit into this area where I have to loop around my thread, I'm going to run this spool back and forth 12 times because there's 12 warp strands in the middle. So I'm just going to do this. So 1, and then 2, 3, 4, and so forth and so on. I'm just moving my spool back and forth and pulling the thread out to guess the length of this loom. And then I'm going to do that 12 times. So the good thing about this thread is that there's a lot of it on that spool, so it's okay to waste a little bit. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to do my trick of winding my thread into one of these bead tubes by tying a double knot over the hole in the top. So I've just tied a knot there, and I'm just going to wind it around this bead tube. So I just finished organizing the John Bead Good thread on this bead tube. So now I'm going to do the same as what I did for these two warp strands, and I'm going to secure it by tying a double knot over the top bar. And from there, I'm just going to warp around the middle. And as you can see, because the bead tube is so narrow, I'm not having any issues at all going through that space. And in fact, towards the end, I use it as kind of almost like a needle to help me tie my knots. Alright, so to count out how many warp strands we have at the end, it's 1, and this is doubled, so it counts as 1. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. And so that creates the 13 spaces for the 13 beads that are going to be forming this row. Now, as you can see, my warp strands are really loose and the tension is not that great. So I'm going to create more tension by stretching out the warp strands at the very end where the loops are with a thick, cheap sewing needle, and I'm going to stick a Sharpie through that, which will stretch the threads out and create more tension. So as you can see, after doing that, the tension is a lot better. So now we're ready to start looming. So to start looming, I'm going to cut about 5 feet of my weft thread, which in this case is my Ceylon D thread. And I'm going to tie a knot on the leftmost warp strand. And I'm doing the leftmost warp strand because I'm right-handed. So feel free to tie yours to the rightmost warp strand and do the opposite of what I'm doing if you are left-handed. So I'm just going to tie a regular overhand knot, which is just like any regular knot. And I'm going to slide my knot down about 1.5 inches from the edge. I'm going to put the rest of my thread under all of my warp strands like this. So I've just put that through my needle and I'm going to pick up my first row. So to read the pattern, we're going to go from bottom to the top and left to right because I'm right-handed, and if you are left-handed and you've tied your knot on the rightmost warp strand, then you're going to go read the pattern from right to left. So I've picked up my first row of beads, and as you can see, it's all white because the first row is not going to matter because I'm going to be using a sliding end-tube clasp, and so the first and the last row is just going to disappear into the clasping, so I'm not going to bother with trying to make the pattern continue onto that row. So here's my first row. I've just slid it down my thread, and now I'm going to put my beads on by going from right to left and positioning my beads one at a time in between each of the open spaces, like this. So push the beads up through the vertical warp strands with your finger so that they pop up. So now I'm going to put my needle over all of the vertical warp strands and through each bead like this. And so as you can see, I'm just going to position each of my bead carefully and slowly, one at a time from right to left. And by doing it this way, we are fixing the beads into each of their spaces before moving on, because this needle is going to keep them in their proper spaces, like that. So once you're done, you're just going to carefully pull all your thread through like this. Now we want all of the spaces to narrow down so that they fit the thickness of the beads properly, but it's going to be hard to do that because our strings are too far apart. So I'm just going to adjust the positioning of the strings by doubling them up into each of the slots, which will narrow down our current working surface to the point where it will be a lot easier to tighten the warp strands to fit the beads better. So to help me out, I'm just going to use a blunt tapestry needle, which I find works better than a sharp needle because it marks up the wood less. And I'm going to carefully lift my thread and move them this way. So now there are 2 warp strands in a single slot. So I'm just going to keep going. And I'm just going to put this double strand into its own slot. And I'm going to do the same for the other side. And as you can see, this narrows down the space a little bit better so that when I pull, it's a lot easier for the threads to cinch up. So I'm just going to do the same for the other side. So now when we pull, it looks a little bit better, but this won't be completely secure until we do a second row. So let's do a second row. So I'm going to take my needle with my thread and I'll put it under all of the vertical warp strands again and pick up my second row in the pattern. So here's my second row and I've slid it down already, and your second row is going to be different depending on how long of a beaded section you're going to need. So make sure you're using the correct pattern for the size of bracelet that you need. And just like what we did with the first row, I'm going to push these beads up with my finger, and I'm going to put my needle above the vertical warp strands and through each of the beads. So make sure that you're putting your needle above the vertical warp strands as you're doing this. And try not to pierce your vertical warp strands. And now when I pull this thread to tighten up the beads, the vertical warp strands are staying in place and they are fitting the correct size of the beads. So to secure this first row better and to prevent it from sliding around like this and making the rest of my bracelet wonky, I'm going to slide a spare beading needle through that first row. And doing that will align your first row like this. See how it's a lot straighter now? And then you can go ahead and just push your beads down against that first row to make them all straight. And I tend to like to move this needle up as I continue beading along my pattern to maintain that alignment. So here's my third row, and it should be a lot easier to push the beads up through all of the spaces because the sizing is now correct. And so I'm just going to pop up all of the beads and put my needle over and through all of the beads. So from here you can just keep going with the pattern, and I'll meet you back once you need to add more thread, and I'll show you how to add more thread. Alright, so I have about 6 to 8 inches of thread left, so I'm going to go ahead and add new thread. So I'm just going to leave this tail alone, and I've cut myself another 4 feet or so of thread, not as much as in the beginning because I'm actually almost at the end of my desired beaded length section. And to add more thread, I'm just going to do what I did in the beginning, which is to tie a simple overhand knot on my leftmost strand and leave a 6 to 8 inch tail like this. So I've left this much of a tail, and I'm going to bead like I did before, and I'm going to take care of all these tails at the very end. So once you've tied on your new strand, just go ahead and continue beading like you were before. So for example, this is my next row of beads, and I've slid it down to the end of my new thread that I've just tied on, and I am just going to pop up the beads through the vertical warp strands and put my needle over the vertical warp strands and through each of the beads and pull my thread through, and that is how I'm going to continue with the beading. So just keep going, and I'll meet you back when we are ready to tie off. Alright, so I've just done my 5-inch beaded section, so now I'm gonna start tying off all the ends. So to start tying off the ends, the first thing I'm going to do is turn my loom so that this end is facing me and the tail is on the right side, just because I'm right-handed and it's a lot easier for me to work from this side. So to tie off, I'm just going to go back 1 row and put my needle through and exit somewhere in the middle. So not the very last bead at the end, but somewhere in the middle, because we want to not have our tail be exposed as we're tying off. And then I'm going to go into a thread bridge in the row above, and you know how there's a thread running under and another thread running over? I'm only picking up the thread bridge of the thread that is running over. So I'm going to pick up a thread bridge like that in between these 2 beads, and I'm going to tie a knot. So to tie the knot, I just basically put my needle through the loop that is created when you put your needle through that thread bridge and pull. So now there's a knot over there, and I'm going to go in the opposite direction now on the same row as where I tie that knot. So I'm going to exit again somewhere in the middle, like there. Then I'm going to go up another row and then pick up another thread bridge an over thread bridge like this. And I'm going to tie one more knot because I like to make at least 2 knots. So see how I'm making a loop? I'm just going to put my needle through this loop like that and draw a knot. And then now I'm going to put my needle through in the opposite direction and come out again somewhere in the middle. And from here, I'm going to do a couple of zigzags, which is basically just me going up a row and going in the opposite direction like this. So now I'm going to go to the right, exit somewhere in the middle, and go to the left and exit somewhere again in the middle. And now I'm going to loop back, so I'm just going to loop around, and that way I'm changing direction and my thread will be a lot more secure. So I'm just going to go back. If you have a knot that is sitting inside this bead and you're finding a hard time putting your needle through, you can just back out of one bead and go down and avoid the bead with the knot, like this. So I'm going to go back down, and because my last row over here, the one that is all white beads, is going to go into my sliding end tube clasp, I'm just going to put my thread through, and I'm just going to go to the very end because I know that it's not going to matter. This tail is not going to be seen and it's going to be inside the clasping. So I'm just going to cut my thread out here, like that. So now I'm just going to go ahead and do all the rest of my tails over here and the one that I have from when I started. And for these middle tails, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just cross them over. So I'm just going to go in this direction. So for this thread, I'm going to zigzag up, and for this thread, I'm going to zigzag down, and that way I am not filling the same row of beads with both threads and overfilling them. And you're welcome to turn your loom around in opposite directions if it will help make it easier for you to put your needle through opposite directions along your rows. I'm just doing it this way for instruction purposes because it's easier to see what I'm doing if I'm not constantly just turning my loom over and over. And it's not an exact science. Sometimes I'm doing zigzagging and sometimes I'm looping around. So after tying off the ends, I'm going to make a small weaving at the end of this piece so that when we tie the warp strands together later on to secure them, there will be a buffer between the knots and the first row of beads. and it'll help to keep them more even. So I've just cut a couple feet of thread and I have run my needle under one of the thread bridges on that first row, and I'm just going to tie a simple overhand knot, and then I'm going to put my needle through the beads and I'm going to pop that knot into a bead to hide it. And I'm going to take my needle all the way to the very end. And I'm just going to cut this tail because I don't really need it anymore. And now to create the weaving, I'm going to go under, over with my needle to make the thread go under, over like this. So I'm going over, under like this. So over, under, over, under, over, under, like that. So every other thread is an over and every other thread is an under. And when you pull, you can use a spare needle to push all the thread so that it will be flush against the beads like this. And now I'm ending on an over. As you can see, this thread is going over that last warp strand. So to hook this last warp strand, I'm going to now go under, over. So under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over, under, over. And again, flush your thread against the beads to keep it nice and clean. And I'm just going to go back and forth one more time. So basically 4 passes, so right, left, because I don't want my weaving to be too thick, because afterwards we're still going to tie knots and we don't want this section to be too bulky or it'll be difficult to put it into the sliding and tube clasp. So I'm ending on an over, so I'm just going to go under, over, and so forth. So there's my small weaving, and to finish off, I'm just going to tie a couple of knots by making a loop and putting my needle through that loop a couple times. So that's once and twice. And I'm just going to stick my needle through the weaving and through there and make my tail come off somewhere in the middle so that it's not sticking out and I don't have to worry about it. And cut. So now I'm going to do the same for the other side. So after we do the weaving, we can now take our piece from the loom. So I'm just going to pull out the marker and also the knobs to release the bracelet. And you also want to cut the loops afterwards so that we can start to tie the warp strands into knots. So you just want to lay down a piece of plastic over your work surface and tape down your bracelet so that it doesn't move around while you're tying the knots. And the reason why we're going to lay down the plastic is because I personally like to glue down my knots. And to glue down my knots, I like to use E6000 Plus. You can also use regular E6000, but I prefer the Plus because this is low odor, so it doesn't smell as bad as regular E6000. So I'm just going to squeeze a small amount of E6000 Plus off to the side. So I'm going to work from left to right, and I'm going to grab the first two strands. So the first strand is doubled. So this pink edge is doubled, and I'm going to consider that as one strand, and I'm going to pick up the one next to it. And I'm going to tie a surgeon's knot. So to tie a surgeon's knot, the first thing we're going to do is go left over right, and put your tail through the loop twice, like this. And before I draw the knot down, I like to add a very small dab of glue into the edge so that I can secure that knot, but this is optional. You can always just add the glue afterwards, but this is just my personal preference. And when working with E6000 Plus, you have to be very careful because the glue is very stringy and very gummy like this. It stretches out. So just put a very little bit on the end of a piece of wire or toothpick. And I'm just going to add a very, very small, tiny amount right there. Just a tiny dab. And then I'm going to draw down that knot like this. So I went left over right, so now I'm going to go right over left and then put my tail through the loop only once and secure that first knot. And just for added security, I'm going to go a third time. So I went right over left, so now I'm going to go left over right and put my tail through the loop once. And tighten. And I'm just going to weigh this down with my thread. So the order is left over right and put it through the loop twice, right over left and put it through the loop once, and then left over right and put it through the loop once. So let me do that again to show you. So here are my next two threads. So left over right and put it through once and then twice, so 2 times. And before I draw it down, I like to add a dab of glue along the end so that my knot gets a little bit of glue in it, and then pull it through to the very edge of your weaving. And then right over left, put it through once. And then left over right, put it through once. So just do the rest. And when you're done tying all of your knots, what I like to do is I like to grab some more of my glue, and now I like to coat all of my knots and the weaving with glue. And it's okay if you get a little bit on your last row of beads. That last row of beads is going to disappear into the sliding end tube clasp, so all of that mess will not be seen. So just go very slow because this glue is very, very thick and messy. I also like to lift and coat my knots also from the bottom, and also the weaving. So when you're satisfied with the amounts of glue you've put on, you can go ahead and do the other side. Once you're done gluing down your knots, then you can take the masking tape off of your bracelet. And what I like to do is I like to take the loom and place it on the plastic, but make sure that it doesn't touch any of the glue that's there, and lay the bracelet over the rods to hang, and so that the glue will not be stuck to the plastic. So E6000 Plus takes 24 hours to cure. So I'm going to wait until tomorrow to cut off the extra thread and put it into the sliding and tube clasp. Alright, so it's been a day, so the glue has cured. So I'm going to take the bracelet and I'm going to trim off the excess thread. So as you can see, the E6000 Plus has dried to a gummy consistency, and so I'm just going to cut close to my knots and leave a bit of a tail just so I don't accidentally cut any of my knots off. And then on my plastic surface, I'm going to put a little bit of E6000 Plus glue, and then I'm going to take my sliding end tube clasp, and right now it's at a 45-degree angle, so I'm gonna use my plier to open it up to closer to about 90 degrees, so that it'll be easier for me to slide the last row of my beads in. And I'm going to smear a little bit of glue in the sliding end tube clasp for extra security. And you also want to try to avoid the slotted area. And slowly and carefully put the last row of my beads into the sliding end tube clasp. And as you can see, this is the reason why we do not want too thick of a weaving, because the glue and the knots create a bunch of extra bulk, and if it were any thicker, it would be way harder to put that last row into the sliding end tube clasp. And after you get in as much as you can, and sometimes you have to use a needle to shove the rest of the knots and that last bead into the very end. I'm using a 20mm sliding end tube clasp here, so it's just exact to the 13 beads. I'm just going to take a plier and close it about 45 degrees. And then I'm going to tap the flap closed using my work surface. And it should look pretty good. It's pretty clean. Oh, and by the way, before I forget, I also want to mention that I'm going to have clasps and split rings and lobster clasps for sale as sets in my coffee shop, because I found that if I wanted to buy more of the sizes that I actually use a lot, it's hard to do that on Amazon. They tend to want to sell you entire sets of various sizes, even the ones that you don't really use as much. So I use usually 20mm and 25mm of sliding end tube clasps for my patterns. And so I've decided to just carry that in my coffee shop if you would like some as well. And I only carry it in this stainless steel finish. And that is because I'm having trouble with the gold plated stuff. There's the bracelet I made in a previous video that I've only worn a few times, and the gold plating is already coming off. And so I just don't want to deal with that, so I'm only carrying this stainless steel one. So to wrap up, I'm going to attach all of my findings. I'm going to be using a split ring, which is like a coiled ring, which is more secure than a regular jump ring, because I find that the metal of the clasp is so thin that sometimes it slips through the crack of a regular jump ring. So I started using split rings because I do believe that the fact that there's no gaps here makes it more secure. So to open it, I'm going to use a split ring opener tool, which looks like this. And I'm just going to open it up like this. And I'm going to drop down a lobster clasp. Like that. And also one side of my bracelet. And I'm just going to rotate the split ring with my plier to just make it easier to make it all go through. And as you can see, one side is attached. And I'm going to attach the other side of my bracelet. Now, normally I attach a charm to this side, but I'm going to do something a little bit different today. I'm just going to tie a cute satin ribbon instead. And if you would like the bow to be more permanent, then you can glue it down, but I'm not going to do that. Alright, so while waiting for the glue to dry, I'm going to make a complementary bracelet. So this is memory wire, and what I have here is an oval shaped memory wire. Memory wire also comes in circular forms in different sizes. So this is just what I have, so this is what I'm going to use. And I'm going to cut myself a loop. So this is where my loop is currently ending. So I'm just going to cut somewhere also close to that area. And I'm using memory wire cutters. You want to use memory wire cutters for memory wire because if you use your regular jewelry flush cutters like this, it's going to damage the blades because this is made of carbon steel or something like that. It's just really hard material and it's going to cause your blade to be nicked. So now I have one loop of memory wire and I'm just going to put masking tape on one side and I'm going to start my pattern. So the pattern for my bracelet is a 4mm fire polish amethyst, followed by a 3mm light pink, followed by another 4mm amethyst. And then I'm going to put on a bellflower facing away from that bead because I want the bellflower to be facing this flower. So now I'm going to put a light pink 3mm fire polish and then a flower. This flower bead might be a bit challenging to get through the curve, but you can just straighten out your memory wire a little bit and it should slide in. And then I'm going to do the reverse and put another light pink 3mm fire polish. And now I'm going to face a bellflower towards this flower. So this is what I have so far, and so now I'm just going to repeat the pattern. I'm going to do 4mm fire polish, 3mm light pink fire polish, 4mm fire polish, bellflower, light pink fire polish, flower bead, and as you can see I'm having trouble sliding it through, so I'm just going to straighten it a little bit like that. $3mm fire polish, bellflower facing in, so when I try it on, I see that I still have a ways to go, but not enough to make a whole unit of the flower with the bellflowers. So all I'm going to do is I'm just going to add on either end, I'm going to add a light pink fire polish and an amethyst bead like this on one side, and then on the other side I'm just going to add also just a light pink and an amethyst fire polish, like that. So that way I only have small beads close to the back of my wrist, which is totally fine. It'll also make it easier for me to put on my clasp. So I'm going to center the beads on my oval as best as I can, and I'm going to start curling the ends to seal them. So I'm just going to put masking tape back on one end so that my beads don't fall off while I'm working on the other side. First, I'm gonna actually cut a little bit off because I don't really need that much to start finishing the ends. So I want just a little over ½ inch. And when I cut, I'm gonna cover this with my hand so that I don't accidentally get that wire in my eye when it comes off. Like that. And now I'm going to take one of my 2 round nose pliers. This is the cheap one because memory wire is so hard that it could ruin your round nose pliers if you don't have the memory wire finishing pliers. So this is just a regular round nose pliers. So as you can see, it's marked up quite a bit. So to finish the ending, I'm going to bend away from the curve. So I'm going to just grasp the memory wire until it is flush with my round nose plier, and I'm going to start turning it away from the curve like this. As you can see, it's facing away from the curve, and I'm going to keep sliding my plier down and turning like this. And you can always just straighten that out if it's a little bit lopsided. Now I'm going to take the tape off and do the other side. So once again, I'm going to cut until I have about ½ inch. So I took that much off, and I'm going to start curling this backwards. Slide your plier down as you go and grab that end like this. So you'll notice that I left a little bit of wiggle room over there, and that's what you want. You don't want to curl your ends to the point where your beads are smushed together and there's no play, because I'm actually going to be adding a clasp to this, and when I add a clasp and try to close it, I'm going to end up bending my bracelet this way. And if you don't leave extra room in your wire, your beads are gonna get too scrunched up together and the edges are gonna start chipping off and your bead might break. So you want to have a little bit of play in your wire so that your memory wire will be able to bend without breaking a bead when you go to close your clasp. So as usual, I will be using a split ring to attach my clasps. So I've gone ahead and made a charm with the butterfly, and I have included a butterfly in the bead set as well if you like the same charm. And I will attach this to the other side. So actually, I only used half the beads that I have included in this set. So you can make bigger sizes of bracelets with the amount of beads I have included here. So here is the final result. I really hope that you like it. I really like tying the bow instead of adding charms because I think that it matches that romantic and cute vibe of cherry blossoms. And I also like that the bracelet complements the loom work pretty well. I think that they go together really well as a pair. So yeah, if you are interested, I do have the bead sets for the bracelet available in my Ko-fi shop, and your purchase supports my channel, so I appreciate it. And thank you again so much for joining me for this tutorial, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!